The Roman state had endured 100 years of expansion, triumph, and internal strain. By the winter of 50–49 BC, the Republic was no longer simply a polity of magistrates and magistracies. It had become a theater of personal power, patronage, and armed men. Two names now defined its fate: Gaius Julius Caesar, rising through conquest and popular support, and Pompey the Great, the Republic's champion turned guardian of the senatorial order. Their clash would test not only armies, but the institutions that bound Romans to one another. If you enjoy detailed histories, stay with us till the end and consider subscribing. In January of 49 BC, the alongshore wind off the Rubicon carried a simple, terrible question. Down a narrow river channel, would a single general bring his legions into Italy and thereby provoke civil war? Caesar stood on the southern bank with his veterans, men who had followed him through Gaul, through winter hardship and victory. They trusted him with their lives and discipline. They trusted him because his commands had filled their purses and honored their standards. Behind the general's quiet, the calculus was cruel and clear. To lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen was to invite prosecution and ruin. To keep his imperium and lead the legions back into Italy was to challenge the Republic. Caesar held the decision like iron in his hand, then bore the die across the water. Alea iacta est, his companions later reported. The die was cast. Rome's response resembled a rupture more than a battle. The Senate, fueled by the fearful rhetoric of the Optimates, declared Caesar an enemy and looked to Pompey, who had taken refuge in the capital's political orbit, to defend the res publica. Pompey, whose reputation rested on victories and the respect of many senators, did not meet Caesar's sudden march in open battle near the city. He withdrew south with much of the Senate and with the treasury, gathering allies, fleets, and men from Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia. Cities opened their gates in panic or loyalty. The streets of Rome filled with the hurried robes and suits of magistrates racing to a new center of authority. Summers and campaigns would soon follow. Caesar moved with speed more than brute force. He understood that the first weeks of such a war would decide whether the Senate's coalition could consolidate power or whether his own momentum, his veterans and reputation could outstrip their preparation. He took the key towns of northern Italy and then turned west to neutralize Pompeian holdouts. Corfinium surrendered in a few days. Caesar's clemency in its aftermath, he released captured senators and magistrates rather than executing them, was a calculated spectacle. It was meant to undercut Pompey's claim that Caesar sought to overthrow the state. It also preserved manpower, avoided protracted sieges, and kept the moral high ground with many provincials. While Italy shifted under Caesar's footfalls, the Iberian provinces remained a dangerous theater. Pompey's men in Spain, Afranius and Petreius among the commanders, held veteran forces and great stores of grain. To deny them a foothold from which to threaten Italy was vital. Caesar detached Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus and other lieutenants to move west. He himself would eventually march to the north of the peninsula in a campaign of marches and decisive blows. Spain tested logistics. Rivers and passes, the need for forage, the speed of detachments. Caesar's legions, seasoned by years in Gaul, moved with a coherence that belied the piecemeal nature of civil war. Supply wagons creaked along roads rutted by rain. Trumpets sounded at dawn. Scouts sent back the scent of smoke from hostile camps. In Spain, Pompeian commanders counted on local alliances and the stubbornness of garrisoned towns. Yet, momentum and superior command quality tilted the balance. Caesar's forces took cities, cut communications, and forced the enemy into more dangerous concentrations where they could be defeated. To the south, along the Mediterranean, the city of Massilia, modern Marseille, stood as a stubborn pocket of resistance. Its walls rose from a rocky promontory. Its harbor sheltered a fleet loyal to Pompey's cause. That siege tested a different set of skills: engineering, blockade, and the diplomacy of neutral cities. Caesar could not afford to let Pompeian commanders use the Massilian fleet to resupply or harry his lines. He assigned sieges and blockades to lieutenants whose names would mark the year, Decimus Brutus and others, while he continued moving toward decisive meetings. Massilia held out for months, its gallant resistance emblematic of the fractured loyalties across the western Mediterranean. The city's eventual fall cost lives and time, but it removed a maritime threat and signaled that Caesar could take fortified towns when he chose. The campaign across the Adriatic led the opposing coalition into the eastern provinces, where Pompey gathered legions and ships. In Greece, the war expanded from politics into grand strategy. Pompey, famed for his logistical sense and his ability to marshal resources, chose terrain that favored his strengths. He relied on his superior numbers and the support of the eastern provinces to cut Caesar off from reinforcements. Caesar, always an aggressive calculator, accepted a precarious approach. His supply lines grew stretched. Deserts of loyalty separated his shore bases from the feeding grounds that could sustain his legions. The first great clash of maneuver unfolded at Dyrrhachium, where Pompey used his fleet and his control of the coast to land forces and seize strong positions. At Dyrrhachium, Pompey achieved much of what he sought. He occupied the higher ground, forged lines of circumvallation, and attempted to hem Caesar in. Caesar attempted to dislodge him by a blend of frontal pressure and probing attacks, but the Pompeian lines were strong, and the naval cordon choked the free movement of grain. For a time, it seemed that Caesar's army might be trapped. The morale in his camp wavered as messages arrived of supply shortages and desertions. In that hour, the temperament of both men showed through. Pompey, cautious by nature and aware of his political standing, hesitated to press a full-scale, annihilating assault that might destroy Caesar completely. He feared the political consequences and the heavy casualties that could stain his own authority. Caesar, meanwhile, accepted risks that most commanders would avoid. He gambled on a sudden assault and, when the moment came, seized an inlet in the Pompeian lines by a daring maneuver. The outcome at Dyrrhachium favored Pompey tactically. He retained his position and inflicted losses, but it failed to deliver the decisive blow that might have ended Caesar's campaign. The war's turning point was not a single hour, but a stiffening of resolve. Caesar learned from the narrow escape at Dyrrhachium. He reorganized his legions, he tightened discipline, he kept his eye on the one advantage he retained in the field, the quality and cohesion of his veteran troops. Pompey, paradoxically, grew more cautious. His coalition contained many men whose loyalty lay with Rome's old order. They brought resources and numbers, but also divergent priorities. Some urged caution, others demanded bold action. The balance between strategic prudence and decisive aggression weighed heavily upon the great commander. In the plain of Pharsalus, in central Greece, the armies met in a decisive encounter that would determine not only the fate of two commanders, but the shape of the Roman world. Pompey arrayed a larger force, relying on cavalry dominance to sweep the flanks and cut Caesar's lines of retreat. Caesar, with fewer men, but centuries of practice in formation and rapid response, anticipated the enemy's plan. He placed reserves in a hidden depth, legions kept back from the initial engagement to strike at the moment when Pompey's cavalry had grown confident and perhaps careless. The battle unfurled with the sound of trumpets and the thunder of men. Dust rose in great clouds under a sky that offered no mercy. At first, the Pompeian cavalry threw back Caesar's horsemen, and the larger force pressed forward as if victory were already written by numbers. Yet the moment that turned the field came when Caesar ordered his reserve infantry to fix the collapsing flank. These men emerged in tight lines and met Pompeian cavalry with the iron discipline of pilum and shield. Horses recoiled, mass and momentum broke into confusion. Pompeian ranks, reliant on their cavalry to exploit the breach, found themselves shortened and under pressure from infantry now advancing with fresh legs. In the chaos of that afternoon, Pompey's numerical superiority proved insufficient. When the rout began, it was sudden. Pompeian soldiers fled toward the coast, their standards tossed and their commanders struggling to hold a semblance of order. Caesar, in the center of that storm, rode among his troops with the composure that had become his trademark. He gave orders not only to press advantage, but to spare Romans where choice permitted. The carnage, though inevitable in civil war, was not to Caesar's honor alone. He allowed those who surrendered to lay down arms. Pompey himself escaped the immediate slaughter. He boarded ships under the confusion of night, leaving behind the provinces and much of his political stature. Pharsalus had not merely decided a battle, it had fractured the coalition that had come to his aid. The political consequences were immediate and bitter. Senators who had fled Rome faced the realization that their political tool, Pompey, had fallen under military control. For many Romans, the sight of two armies clashing on Greek soil was an affront to the ideals that had bound Rome for centuries. Yet practical politics were cruelly pragmatic. Pompey fled first to Mytilene, then to Tarsus, and finally sought refuge in Egypt, a kingdom where dynastic courts could offer sanctuary or treachery. The moment Pompey set foot upon Egyptian soil, his fate was sealed by a politics of its own. Ptolemy XIII's advisors feared Rome's victor and sought to ingratiate themselves by eliminating the fallen champion. Pompey, who had been the Republic's foremost general, was murdered upon disembarkation, stabbed and beheaded by agents who hoped to win Caesar's favor. News of Pompey's death reached Caesar as he landed in Egypt. The sight of the body, of the head presented on a purple cloth, provoked in him an eruption that was at once personal and public. Whether he had intended to forgive Pompey publicly or to pursue him as an adversary mattered little now. The spectacle of a Roman triumvir cut down by Eastern court intrigue symbolized the collapse of republican norms on which both men had once relied. In private, Caesar mourned the loss of a man who had been his enemy, but whose stature had set the terms of Roman ambition. Publicly, he used the episode to consolidate his position in the East, to secure grain and loans, to settle debts, and to win allies among kings wary of Rome's new singular force. Beyond the drama of dying generals, the war's arithmetic was harsh. Provinces changed hands, magistrates were displaced, and senatorial authority diminished. The legions that had once been instruments of foreign conquest now determined domestic rule. Supply lines that crossed seas and mountains determined which cities lived and which withered of starvation. Standards that once symbolized Rome's civil identity became tokens of loyalty to men, not to institutions. Cities rebuilt their economies around the presence of an army or mourned its loss. The legal edicts, decrees, and senatus consulta that had been the Republic's language grew thin against the reality of armored men at a commander's fist. Amid the grand motions of strategy and the spectacle of Pharsalus, ordinary soldiers suffered the most predictable fate. Veterans marched on foreign soil, far from hearth and family. They fought comrades who had once dined with them in Italy's winter quarters. Civilians in besieged towns sent out supplicants with petitions. Some opened their walls to whichever army promised honor and grain. Others burned their records and fled. The human cost showed in empty fields, in towns that shifted allegiance like flags in a storm, and in the faces of men who knew the better world had been cut into two. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus did not end resistance. Scattered holdouts in Africa and the East refused to yield. Commanders such as Cato and young Brutus weighed their options, and men loyal to the old order saw in Pompey's flight not defeat, but a cause still worth defending. The war would therefore continue, not as a single pitched battle, but as a series of sieges, naval actions, and political settlements that stretched Rome's energies and imagination. The Republic's institutions, already frayed by patronage and factionalism, could not be restored yet by victory in the field alone. In the immediate aftermath, Caesar faced both triumph and the hard work of governance under arms. He had to feed his soldiers, settle the captured provinces, and decide the fate of those who had opposed him. His choices, clemency in some cases, punishment in others, shaped the tone of Roman rule as much as any battlefield decision. He began to govern with the same mixture of magnanimity and ruthlessness that had characterized his campaigning, rewarding loyalty, neutralizing danger, and using public spectacle to legitimate power. The death of Pompey in Egypt was a grim coda, but it did not confer an easy legitimacy on Caesar. Instead, it underlined the new reality. Roman power no longer flowed solely from law or from ancient custom. It now rested in the hands of those who could command obedience and logistics across the sea and the field. Caesar's march from the Rubicon to Pharsalus had shown how an individual could seize the mechanisms of the state and remake them in his own image. The Republic, for many Romans, still had value, but the path by which it might be restored was uncertain. As winter fell and camps emptied in the east, voices in Rome and across the provinces began to ask a different question. What would be the shape of Roman authority after the war? Some looked to reconstruction and reconciliation, others to purges and reprisals. The legions expected pay and lands. The senatorial class feared loss of dignity. The provinces wanted security and grain. None of these desires could be satisfied without reshaping the institutions that had governed Rome for centuries.
The war's immediate arc, from the Rubicon's cold water to the dusty plains of Pharsalus and the treacherous sands of Egypt, had resolved one contest but left another open. How would Rome reorganize power when its most cherished norms no longer held the same force? Caesar had emerged the dominant military figure, but the task of transforming victory into stable rule depended upon politics as much as on the sword. The next campaigns, the shifting alliances in Africa and the East, and the subtler battles over law and office, would determine whether the Republic could be saved or whether a new form of rule would take its place. Caesar paused, briefly, to tend the wounded and to station garrisons, while men who had once stood opposed to him reorganized their hopes in distant harbors. The river crossings, the broken standards, and the empty tribunals would be catalogued by historians, but for the living, the choices remained immediate. Feed the legions, secure the provinces, and determine the price of victory. Pompey's flight to Egypt would do more than remove one opponent. It would drag Rome into the intrigues of Eastern courts and open the way to new alliances and new conflicts that would occupy Caesar and his successors. The war, for now, had shown that personal ambition and institutional fragility could combine to reshape history. It had also made clear that military genius, skillful deployment of men, nimble logistics, and a command style that inspired loyalty could outmatch numerical superiority when applied with timing and resolve. Yet Pharsalus, like the crossing of the Rubicon, would remain a symbol as much as a military success, a marker of the point at which Rome's internal order unraveled and its future demanded reinvention. Caesar would not let Pompey's death be a private thing. News of the murder came to him like a stain upon the purpose for which he had marched. It altered neither his advantage nor his responsibility. He took ship for Alexandria because the Eastern courts now mattered to Rome's security and to the image of a commander who had to make the world yield to order as much as he had made armies yield to him. He could not leave the fate of Mediterranean trade, grain supplies, and local power to rumor and to the caprice of a child king and his eunuchs. A strong hand and a face of Rome were required on the Nile. Alexandria, with its docks and colonnades and the restless hush of a city that regarded itself as the equal of any Hellenic polis, received him as a spectacle and a threat. The palace was a maze of marble and intrigue. The Alexandrians, Greeks and Egyptians intermingled in markets where the smell of fish and spice rose from wooden boats. The royal household, meanwhile, was a stage for guardians and generals whose loyalties were brittle. Pothinus and Achillas, the king's tutors and captains, had their own designs. They had welcomed Pompey's murder as a service to Ptolemaic self-interest, believing the offering would win Rome's favor. Caesar's arrival denied them certainty. He entered the royal quarter with the cautious insolence of one who had seen a republic crumble, and who had every reason to despise the petty calculations of client kings. He stood over the body of Pompey as one stands over an old treaty turned to ashes. There was no triumph, only an ugly proof that the old rules were dead. He demanded men and ships. He spoke with firmness that carried the weight of victory. The palace would not be a place of peaceful adjudication. That winter, the city convulsed in fits of violence that were local and symbolic at once. One group would rally for the young Ptolemy XIII and his regents. Another, stirred by Greek factions and by traitors who had swallowed Roman power for the safety it promised, would look to a Hellenistic queen who had the wit and will to seize aid from a powerful ally. Cleopatra had been driven into the desert, not into obscurity. She had, by then, begun to gather the threads of a plan that turned on outwitting stronger men rather than confronting them with force. Caesar's name reached her as a danger, then as an opportunity. The stories that followed, of words spoken in secret and of a woman who knew how to fold herself into an ambassador's arms, would be told with varying fervor. What matters is the fact itself. Caesar accepted her. The bond they formed was as much political as personal. He needed a client ruler who could secure the grain of Alexandria and neutralize the faction that had murdered a Roman consul. She needed a Roman arbiter who could give her back a throne. Their alliance tipped a local dynastic quarrel into a Roman intervention. The Alexandrian War that followed was brief and ugly. Achilles, who led the army for Ptolemy's faction, was a stubborn general, more used to the pitched work of mercenary bands than to the intricacies of siegecraft against a commander who had learned to use engineering and discipline as weapons. The fighting braided street skirmish to naval standoff. At times, Caesar's men were hemmed within the palace precincts. At times, the Roman standards were carried up thoroughfares lined with burning shops. Fires licked the docks. Some records and warehouses, perhaps parts of the library stores, were consumed in the chaos. That loss of scrolls, of an intellectual patrimony, would be mourned by scholars and envied by the careless. But for the living, the matter was immediate. Victory would have to be made by arms and by political settlement. When Caesar's legions broke the resistance and Cleopatra returned to the palace as queen, she did so under Rome's shadow. Her coronation, in those circumstances, was a legal fiction as much as a political triumph, a compact secured by a foreign sword.
Rome had made a new client, and in the bargain had drawn itself further into the tangled affairs of the East. Caesar left a detachment to secure the city and took with him a royal entourage that announced Rome's claim to influence. He moved on to Syria, to the cities of Asia, and to the provinces that demanded settlement. His mind always angled toward the next obligation: provision for his veterans, organization of the provinces, the suppression of pockets of resistance. Resistance in the western provinces resolved itself into a concentrated will rather than into isolated rebellions. Men who had rejected Caesar's authority, Pompeian veterans, partisan senators, zealots of the old order, gathered with a caution born of failing options. In Africa, a coalition hardened around Metellus Scipio and the stoic figure of Cato the Younger, who had retreated to Utica with the dignity of a man who would rather die in principle than live in a comfortable compromise. Scipio and the Pompeian heirs, Gnaeus and Sextus, sought recruits among the provincials and the remaining ships of the Mediterranean. They hoped that distance and the heat of the southern coast would erode Caesar's resources. They hoped also that moral outrage would carry recruits in coin. Caesar did not underestimate them. He calculated, as he always had, the arithmetic of men, grain, and roads. He crossed to Africa with a seasoned portion of his veterans, those who had stood with him through Gaul and Italy and Pharsalus. The campaigns there were fought with the same mixture of discipline and improvisation that had served him before. At Ruspina he encountered fierce resistance and paid with men. At Thapsus, the confrontation turned into a decisive battle in which his legions, trained and cohesive, cut through the Pompeian lines.
Scipio's coalition crumpled. Cato, refusing the dishonor of a captured life, chose a grave by his own hand in Utica. His death sent a chill through the Roman tradition. It was the death of a conscience, sharp and unyielding, and it left a republic without one of its sternest critics. The victory in Africa did not end the struggle. There were still Pompeian holdouts in Hispania, where Gnaeus and Sextus took refuge among sympathizers. Caesar crossed the sea again to Spain, where he faced a stubborn resistance at Munda. The battle there, fought on a plain under a sky that seemed indifferent to Roman fate, was bloody and uncertain. Caesar's forces suffered. At times the old legions faltered. But experience and command, and a will that would not tolerate a second reversal, pushed Rome through. The Pompeian sons fell back. Gnaeus perished in flight, and Sextus escaped, but with his cause broken. Munda closed the military horizon for the moment. There were no great armies left in the field to oppose Caesar's will. Triumph followed in the capital.
Rome received its commander with the ceremonies it still possessed: processions, spoils, sacrifices, and a Senate that had to bend, however reluctantly, to the realities he imposed. Yet triumph did not mean unanimity. The city itself was altered. Veterans held land in colonies outside Rome. The civic shrines had been visited by soldiers who had seen the world and demanded recompense. Conservative senators saw their authority reduced to ritual, while power concentrated in men who could command men in the field. Caesar's personal authority, fortified by victory, by patronage, and by the spectacle of public works, grew. He set about many reforms that bore the imprint of a ruler who liked order and efficiency. Laws to settle the grain supply, measures to reorganize municipal life, colonies assigned to veterans, and administrative tweaks that sought to bind the provinces more closely into a single organism under Rome's aegis. Among these acts of governance was a measure toward time itself, the calendar. The Roman year, tied to pontifical calculation and to political whim, had long been awkward and open to manipulation. Caesar, with the counsel of learned men from Alexandria, and with the practical bent of a soldier who liked plans that unfolded on time, imposed a reform that would regularize the year, and, in doing so, impose a rhythm upon civic life. The Julian calendar, by aligning months with the solar course and by introducing a leap day, would be adopted and endure. It was, on its face, a technical correction. Beneath it lay a message that the state would impose order even upon the heavens' measurement. Still, authority imposed by sword and administrative edict carries seeds of instability. Cleavages remained. Men of senatorial rank retained resentments, private enmities, and grudges that had been inflamed by civil war. Veterans expected generous distributions. Provincials wanted security and less interference from Roman tax farmers. The urban poor demanded grain and spectacle. Aristocrats nursed the memory of a republic they felt slipping through their fingers. Caesar's solution, an energetic central hand that balanced generosity with firmness, did not erase these tensions. It transformed them. Political life became an exercise in patronage and spectacle as much as in lawmaking. Office holders found themselves beholden to a general whose favor could make or break careers. Within that changing landscape, personal bonds mattered as well. Allies who had stood with him, Mark Antony, Lepidus at different times, and others, occupied roles that paid homage to their loyalty, but also reminded Rome that power was now distributed through a network shaped by military loyalty rather than merely by ancestral standing. The old cursus honorum, the ladder by which men climbed through offices, now sat beside newer paths, the path of a commander who could raise men and move them across seas. Ambition and gratitude braided into new institutions of power. Yet, even as Caesar settled scores and reorganized institutions, the memory of civil rupture remained. Families mourned those lost in battle. Small towns saw columns that had once brought soldiers now bearing new magistrates. Old laws were debated and amended, sometimes in haste, sometimes with a care that came from the desire to secure a fragile order. Rome had the outer trappings of stability.
roads mended, grain ships arriving more reliably, festivals staged with renewed splendor. But beneath those signs lay a question older than any leader. Could a polity accustomed to a complex balancing of communal honor and private ambition survive when that balance had been forcibly recast? Caesar thought in large measures. He believed that strong rule, guided by a mixture of clemency and ruthless clarity, could achieve what the old republic's indecisions had not. He sought to make the law clear, to reward the loyal, and to reshape civic life so that a single, coherent policy could be enforced across Rome's vast territories. Yet he also understood the limits of imposition. To govern men by force alone is to ignore the human need for dignity. To govern by law alone among peoples long accustomed to local custom is to court rebellion. So his policy was hybrid. Roman law and tradition, administered by men tied to him by oath and by patronage. Cities given nominal self-government under the protection of standards that bore his name. Even then, the core problem of legitimacy, how to make people accept a new center of power, remained. Caesar leaned upon spectacle, games, lavish distributions, and public works that would bind gratitude to the memory of his beneficence. He also restructured the magistracies in ways that made the old aristocracy less able to use office as a private instrument. That produced enemies who called him a tyrant, even as others praised him as the savior of order. The vocabulary of politics hardened into succinct accusations. New lords and old republicans now faced each other across a rhetorical chasm that also contained real danger. In streets and in atria, in markets and by hearths, men and women debated what had been won and what had been lost. Veterans told their stories of camp and battle with a bluntness that disdained theory. Scholars debated the fate of learning and lamented the losses of scrolls and scriptoria. Merchants measured fortune in the steadiness of grain shipments. Mothers counted infants and prayed that the city's peace would hold. Caesar moved through such a world with the certainty of a man who had been trained to act, to decide, and to command. Yet even he could not decree the hearts of all Romans. The years that followed Pharsalus were thus a mixture of administrative labor and the relentless vigilance of a man who had remade politics into a discipline of consequence. He legislated, he reappointed, he entertained foreign kings and arranged marriages, and he continued to sail where necessity or ambition summoned him. His reforms reached into the provinces and the city. His patronage reached into the households of men who had served at his side. But the memory of civil contest and the residue of republican honor did not vanish with victories and laws. They gathered in whispers and in the resentful silence of the old Senate houses. Where such quiet breeds, conspiracies can grow. In Rome's great basilicas and in private rooms where senators still met, talk turned from administration to the person at the center. Some argued that the man who had delivered stability deserved honors that would secure longevity, titles, priesthoods, perpetual dictatorships. Others answered that such honors would render the republic a memory, its laws ornaments for a court. The contrast between practical success and principled fear tightened like a wire. Caesar, who had always known how to move between calculation and force, held within his person both the source of order and the mark of fear. He ruled as a general who had become civil magistrate, and in so doing he had altered the very grammar of Roman power. The question that began at the Rubicon and had been sharpened at Pharsalus and in the Egyptian sands thus returned in new forms. Could Rome preserve itself by adapting its institutions to the needs of an empire increasingly governed by men accustomed to war? Or would the practices of patronage, command, and spectacle hollow out the civic life until only the shell of the old republic remained? Men debated, historians would catalogue, and the city kept breathing, its life a mixture of grain and rumor, of law and the clatter of soldiery. Caesar continued to govern, to transform, and to invite both praise and opposition. The future of Rome, while directed by his hand for a time, remained unsettled at its core. Whispers bred conviction in rooms that had once spoken only in cautious civility. The men who moved most quietly were often those who had been quickest to live by the sword. Their courtesy carried the weight of iron. Cassius paced more than he spoke, his face a map of old grievances sharpened by recent insult. Brutus, whose name carried the memory of ancestors who had stood for a republic, wore a calmer mask, less of fury than of necessity. Between them and others, Decimus, Trebonius, Casca, Cimber, there formed an architecture of resolve, small committees, rehearsed words, the careful choice of place and hour. They argued not in the language of power, but in the language of duty. They called Caesar a danger to Rome's liberty, and liberty, once uttered, demanded action. For his part, Caesar continued the work that had come to define him. He could pardon, legislate, award lands and titles. He could order a road or a grain supply with the certainty of a man who had learned to make the state into an instrument of policy. He had become less a man among equals and more a center around which the city's life rotated, some turning gratefully, others grinding resentfully. He accepted honors while pressing onward with reforms. The calendar altered to bring the civil year in line with the sun, veteran colonies planted in distant provinces, citizenship extended like a measure of balm and control. He loved spectacle because spectacle made memory. Triumphs were not mere vanity, but instruments by which gratitude would be fixed. Yet the more he fixed it, the more the old forms of republican liberty seemed like relics to be cherished by those who remembered. Omens and small cruelties threaded the days. A soothsayer's cautions, already once spoken in mockery, were repeated in taverns. Calpurnia, his wife, dreamed in the depth of the night of blood that did not wash away, and of the city broken by grief. She pressed him to remain within, to postpone his visit to the Senate, where flattering hands and hidden daggers might meet. Portents gathered in other ways, prodigies in the sky, sacrifices which bulked at the knife, a pale and sudden chill in the air of an early spring. But Caesar had always measured the world by his will, and the calendar of the state had a business that would not wait for superstition. Decimus Brutus, a man whose loyalty Caesar had rewarded with command and favor, spoke to him with the particular skill of a flatterer who could also be honest. "They will mock your staying home," Decimus told Caesar, "and the flatterers of men who must act are sometimes as persuasive as their swords." Thus, on the morning set by the conspirators, the city opened with little more than its usual bustle. The forum filled with merchants, clients, and rumor. The Curia of Pompey, newly used because the Senate House still stood in need of repair, received its daily traffic. Caesar walked with a semblance of his accustomed composure, though he did not look as if the world were all his. He greeted the familiar faces that bowed low, and the veterans who took his hand with blunt affection. In the narrow ways, his retinue thinned. Political familiarity required a thinner entourage, or perhaps he wished, for once, to move without the trappings that might attract notice. The conspirators had chosen carefully. They would meet him in the Senate, where solemnness could hide violence behind official form. Their plan was not theatrical, it was efficient, a series of quick thrusts directed to the man whose authority they feared. They moved like men whose practice was in war, brief, coordinated, without hesitation. They had rehearsed their speeches, lined up their knives within their togas, and chosen the moment when petitions and pleasantries would bring Caesar within reach. To them, the act was restoration, to bring the state back to forms that had been soaked in blood long before their time. To them, it was not suicide, but sacrifice. When the hour came, the Curia filled, and the petitions began. Senators rose with supplications that were equal parts deference and cunning. Casca, always blunt, moved first, his hand thrust like a thorn. The first blow was not ceremonial. It was a man's hand finding its mark. The confusion that followed was immediate and terrible. Caesar tried to turn. His toga was stained quickly with stems of red. Hands that had once touched his shoulder in friendship fanned outward in a single, devastating choreography. Brutus's name, above all others, was the one that rent certain hearts. Whether he struck first or last, the stories would differ with each telling, but his presence in the circle was the knife that made the wound personal. Words in the midst of blood are small things. Whether any speech was uttered, whether Caesar spoke back, is already a place where history and rumor meet. Those who loved him later would say he looked upon Brutus as upon a son. Those who had plotted would say only that he died like a tyrant. The Senate chamber filled with the sound of garments and the dull, dropping thud of a man who had once stood with victory in his stride. They left him where he fell, between a statue and the eyes of men. His blood darkened the marble, his purple sank into the dust of a place that had smelled of laurel and law. For a moment there was stillness, as if the city itself had paused to listen. Then, like a bell struck, noise rose. Shouts, the clamor of men who ran, the sudden breath of the street returning to a city that had been made unsteady. The conspirators went forward with their plan to speak to the people. They climbed the rostra and declared that by their hands the old liberties were to be restored. They pledged to release prisoners, to reform magistracies, to bind themselves to the old magistrature of Rome. But their words were brittle against a different and unpredictable force. Grief transmuted to fury on the lips of the common people. Antony, who had been Caesar's colleague in arms and a man whose warmth toward the fallen was as public as any of Caesar's gifts, moved through those first hours with care. He did not confront the conspirators in the Senate that day. He withdrew, and in withdrawal took counsel with those who might carry the pulse of the city. In the course of a few days, the streets of Rome filled with bodies bearing tokens and laurel wreaths. The city, accustomed to spectacle, found in funerary display a new intensity. Antony, attending to the rites, permitted Caesar's body to lie in the forum. In obedience to ancient custom, the people filed past. He spoke then, not with the arrogance of a rival, but with the slow, careful accumulation of sorrow. His words, more insinuating than the blunt claims of the conspirators, laid bare the memory of favors, of bread distributed, of men spared. He produced Caesar's will, revealing legacies and the magnanimities of a ruler who had distributed largesse to the people. Grief, confronted with such visible charity, found a direction. Mourning became accusation. The crowd's lament turned to rage, and in that rage the conspirators saw the first tremors of their miscalculation. The city burned, not in literal fire at first, but in a fury of voices. The mob that had once been fed and amused by Caesar's policy now felt deprived of its patron. They named the men who had killed him as enemies and scoured the streets for their houses. Where the conspirators had thought to plant liberty, they found instead a root of resentment that had taken hold among those who had been beneficiaries of Caesar's largesse. Clusters of men gathered at Antony's behest. He rallied them with a firmness that matched the city's new need for a leader who could command grief and not merely provoke it. The Senate, shaken and thin, attempted to navigate a course between appeasing the crowd and preserving its dignity. Its proclamations were weak reeds against the gale. The funeral itself became the crucible of Rome's immediate fate. Antony's skill at rhetoric, less a knife than a molding hand, turned the public mind. He recited in his own style, not with the great, cold phrases of the conspirators, but with recollections that made each listener feel unjustly bereft. He set before the crowd images of Caesar's kindness, pardons, distributions, the coins stamped in Rome's name, and then allowed the feeling to surge without restraint. A crowd that had once been sated with bread and spectacle now demanded vengeance, and in demanding it consumed the fragile order the senators had believed they could restore by force. By the end of the days that followed the assassination, Rome's streets were no longer simply thoroughfares of trade. They were an arena where what had been political theory was now immediate fate. Bodies of the slain were burned on pyres, the ashes mingling with the dust of Roman roads. The ascent the conspirators had coveted did not come. Men who had thought only of honor found themselves fugitives, their houses attacked, their names hissed. Antony, who might have stood as a friend to the Republic or its newest master, chose instead to command the mourning, to shape it into will. He gathered Caesar's loyalists and veterans to him, and in that gathering, the possibility of a new alignment of power took form. Beyond the city, in the provinces and in the legions, the news cut differently. In camps along the Rhine and the Danube, in the warm fastnesses of Spain and the unpaid outposts of Gaul, soldiers and commanders listened for direction. Some lamented a leader whose victories had given them pay and land. Others feared the chaos of a republic once more in the throes of factional dispute. Governors who had been appointed by Caesar now faced questions of allegiance. To the men who had slain him? To the Senate whose authority was now frayed? Or to the memory of the warlord who had repaid service with reward? In those weeks, Rome did not answer easily. The law that Caesar had fashioned in his own image, bureaucratic, persuasive, far-reaching, had made him more than a mere magistrate. It had made him a locus for the hopes and fears of many. With his death, those hopes flickered and those fears widened. The conspirators had aimed at a restoration. They had not, perhaps, fully understood how deeply a century of war and patronage had altered the soil upon which such restoration would have to be planted. They had killed a man whom many loved and many hated. They had not killed the patterns that had produced him. Order could not be rebuilt from marble declarations alone. And so the city began to spin toward sequences no one had planned. Old aristocrats who had opposed Caesar measured rises and falls anew. Veterans demanded recompense. Men like Antony and Lepidus readied friends and legions. A young Octavian, far from Rome and with an unassuming name, moved in ways that would come to matter beyond his years. The skeleton of the Republic faced a season that would test whether its bones could hold flesh again, or whether a new body would form upon its remains. The question that had shadowed Caesar throughout his career, what is Rome to be, republic or empire, now would be argued with an urgency no Senate debate had ever known. In private rooms where men still kept lamps with trembling hands, Brutus and his fellows debated the course they had set. Some believed themselves saviors. Some whispered that the city's anger was a proof of their necessity. They had not foreseen Antony's eloquence, nor the manner in which largesse and memory could be marshaled against an act meant to restore civility. Outside, the forum filled with crowds who carried laurel and torches. Within, the Senate trembled with the knowledge that a single deed had loosened a multitude of forces. The weeks that followed the killing were not a courthouse for guilt, but a testing ground for power. Antony's house became a center of magnetism. Pompey's old theaters filled with men who remembered other times and other rulers. The line between rhetoric and reality blurred. Proclamations were written and rewritten. The dead man's will was read aloud and used as argument. The law was invoked as both shield and spear. Rome, which had for so long been the maker of orders, found itself engulfed by an orderless fever. In the midst of such upheaval, the body of Julius Caesar lay in the forum for a time, before the city demanded the right proper for its greatest. And it burned on a pyre that the people he had favored piled. The flames rose, and with them a cry that would not be easily stilled. Mourning, accusation, and the undeniable knowledge that a polity could trick itself into thinking it controlled the current of history, when, in truth, one sharp act could change the river's course forever. Men left the pyre and faced anew their private calculations. Whom to trust, where to march, which oath to keep. Rome's streets had been touched by death. Their next shape would be made by those who dared to seize whatever remained of command. It was in that unsettling interval, between the falling of the body and the assembling of new alignments, that the city awaited an answer no one yet could give. Men who fancied themselves restorers found that the Republic was not a garment to be put back on at will. It was a living thing whose habits had been altered. And the hands that had killed Caesar, though they had struck in the name of liberty, now braced themselves against a future that might well answer them with ruin, or with a new kind of rule they had not intended. The stakes were no longer theoretical. They were the simple, mortal wagers of survival, loyalty, and consequence. The stage was set, and Rome, its breath held, watched as the players moved into the next act.